recording. And now is the awkward time in which we are waiting for people to join us. And we're going to sit here and I'm just going to drink because I'm awkward like that. But everybody can drink. So that's.
I've missed this because it's something that it's like one of the few things I do completely separate from grad school. So I liked it. It's fun. So I'm happy that we're back.
It's not entirely separate. I mean, it is kind of like a thing
true.
related to being a historian.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but basically I don't think anybody except one person that we called from Berkeley has actually seen this, which is really funny. Yeah.
But it's like random. Like it's like I actually was in a coffee shop. So I live in Southwest Virginia. I live in Blacksburg, which is where Virginia Tech was. And I was in a smaller town just for, I was running an errand or something like that, like around here. I went into a coffee shop and this dude behind me just said, like, "Are you Matt Gabriel by any chance?" I was like, yeah. Like, and so oftentimes, like, I am kind of a political person around. So like it's somebody, when they say that, they want to yell at me. It's like, "Oh man, I used to love drinking with historians." And I was just like, that's amazing. Bonus, my wife was with me at the time. So like, I got huge props that I got recognized in the random coffee shop. So I was very happy about that.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know, we can get started if we think.
Yeah. Let's get rolling. So welcome back to Zombie Drinking with Historians, back from the dead, or maybe Lazarus is Drinking with Historians. If you want to do a little more, was that Lazarus a zombie? Maybe we'll tackle that in a future episode. We'll get some religious studies people on and we'll talk about it. Anyway, welcome back to Drinking with Historians. We've been here since, we've been gone since August of 2021. I'm Matt Gabriel, I'm a professor at Virginia Tech. And we are joined by, and of course, my colleague and co-host Varsha, who's at UC Berkeley. We are joined today by Adam Rothman, who's at Georgetown University. And our first question, which we will start with again, is Adam, what are you drinking tonight?
I am drinking a Four Roses bourbon, but I do want to point out that I'm actually drinking it out of a Southern Association of Women Historians bourbon glass.
Wow.
I want to give a shout out to SAWH, which I purchased at the most recent Southern Historical Association conference.
Wow, the AHA should sell merch like that. I think all
whiskey glasses. Yeah, that would be great.
I think they should. I think they should. Yeah. What about you, Matt? What are you drinking?
So I'm drinking whiskey as well. I felt the theme from our Twitter conversations, and so I went with that. I'm drinking a Woodford double oaked bourbon, which is just really nice and really lovely and smooth, very caramelly. So after I ate some ribs this evening, and so I felt that was appropriate to kind of wash them down. So, and you, Varsha, what about you?
I'm drinking one of my favorite bourbons, Leopold Brothers Straight Bourbon Whiskey. They also have, I don't know where it is right now. Here it is. They have one of my favorite bottles that I ever bought. I spent like all my birthday money on this. It's 3-chamber rye whiskey. It's expensive, but the bourbon is really sweet. And you can like really smell the vanilla in it, which is why I like bourbon. It's one of my favorite things about, if you get into bourbon history, it's one of my favorite things about American whiskey compared to Scotch. So. Yeah.
Excellent.
You guys are very sophisticated. Very sophisticated. The caramel and the vanilla. I'm like, this is very bourbony.
I mean, that's what it should be, right? It's not like you came on with like, with Scotch and you're like, yeah, I put an ice cube in this. Sorry, I don't want to start that war. I won't start that war. But yeah, so Adam, you're a historian of the Civil War, and the Civil War and slavery, and a lot of things having to do with race have been in the news for like ages now. And I was just teaching my students yesterday about how to make a historical argument. And I came back to this question I was asked on my naturalization exam, or that's on the possible list of questions for the naturalization exam. And I looked it up, and what the question is, name one problem that led to the Civil War. And the possible answers you could give, right? They'll accept any of these answers, is slavery, economic reasons, and states' rights. So what do you sort of think about that the, National Immigration Service is thinking, oh yeah, they can answer any of these answers and that's okay?
Any of those answers is acceptable?
Yep, any one of those answers. You can't give up.
That's unfortunate. But actually the first thing that occurs to me is the distinction between slavery and economic reasons. I mean, what do they think slavery was? Do they think slavery was not somehow, the circle of slavery and the circle of economic reasons are distinct? I mean, what is slavery but an institution of labor from which people made mountains of profit? So I don't know, seems like an economic institution among other things. So it's just kind of weird how people separate out those things into different boxes when they're really all tangled together.
Yeah.
It's hard to, yeah.
So,
Do you think that, go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
well, I'm just kind of curious, and like where do they get their answers from? Like are there historians on staff at the Immigration Naturalization Service, or are they just like, what are they reading? And I'm thinking about this too as everything like history has been in news for a little while, right? And especially American history is like what are people reading in order to understand, like when they're trying to kind of exclude kind of African American history or Black history from American history, or like in government situations in which that's an official kind of government stance about what the meaning of the causes of the Civil War were. So like what are they doing there?
Yeah, I find it fascinating. And I think it really does sort of speak to the fact that there probably aren't historians at the USCIS, which would be sad, but there should be.
Well, I mean, at least they're asking the question.
Yeah.
And, providing a set of possible answers. I read recently, I think it was a review by Elizabeth Cohen of, I don't know, I want to say it was a book by John Meacham, I can't remember. But in this review, Cohen cited a poll that half of Americans didn't know that the American Revolution came before the Civil War. I thought this was like a stunning statistic to me. I don't really believe it. I would like to know where Cohen is getting her information from, but she's a very good historian, so presumably this is on some level a reliable source. But it was kind of shocking that there are some things you really just expect people to know, and one of them is some basic chronology. Like, people don't even have to know the years. They don't have to know what year the revolution was or the year the Civil War started, but they at least should know the order that they occurred in, don't you think?
Yeah. I'm really skeptical. I mean, like, but is that like, I mean, there always seems to be this kind of outrage every once in a while. It's like, all these people don't know about the Holocaust, and then you dig down into the data, and like the questionnaire is like, it has nothing to do with that, or it's like a weirdly formatted question, and so in which it's kind of ambivalent about it, or they were asking like random people or something like that. So like is knowledge of American history actually that bad? And I think, I mean, that's a really, it seems to me a really important question, because we're talking about like AP things with Florida, and like kind of the meaning of the American nation and American history kind of generally. Like, so are people misinformed, or are they better informed, and we're arguing about interpretation? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. Like every historian, I think it's always both. But what do you think, Adam?
Well, I put this on Twitter, and the response was interesting. There was a lot of people thought that the statistic was actually quite plausible. It seemed to make sense to them that like half of Americans would know the most basic facts about American history. And I think it, we are all historians. We care about history. We think about history a lot. We teach history to students who at least show up for our classes. So we have this
mostly
sense that most of the people around us at least care a little bit about history, have to know something about it. But maybe that's just our little bubble, and most people in the world, most people in the country, most people in the world couldn't care less about all this stuff. Like, it has no meaning or relevance to their daily lives, and they just don't pay attention to it. I think that's kind of so plausible and sobering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A good way that sort of connects to, I think it's your first book, Slave Country. I think you wrote it in 2005. And basically you're sort of talking in that book about how slavery expands in the US, right? So based on sort of that book, as well as a lot of your research, why did you sort of decide to write that book of the idea of, how slavery sort of expands militarily, economically, and how it's essential to understanding American history? Because I'm assuming slavery is important in the courses you teach at Georgetown.
Yes, quite. We can talk about that as well. So I was in grad school in the 90s and studying with some wonderful historians of slavery, Barbara Field and Eric Foner, among others. And I thought when I first got into grad school, I thought about doing some other stuff, but those folks just have this gravitational pull, and you can't escape. But reading historiography, to me, it seemed like there was this rich historiography about slavery in the colonial era, colonial North America, and there was an equally rich historiography about slavery in the antebellum era, meaning the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, leading up to the Civil War. But there still wasn't a really good historiography that bridged the two, that explained how we got from the colonial system of slavery to what we know of as really the 19th century history of slavery, or the second slavery, some people call it. And they're very different. There's some big changes that happen from the late 18th to the early 19th century. So that's what Slave Country was trying to trace. Why and how does slavery get completely transformed in the decades following the American Revolution? The enslaved population grows in number. It spreads into what we now know today as the Deep South. The basis of the slave economy shifts from colonial commodities like rice and indigo and tobacco to cotton and sugar. And the slave population itself makes a transition from being at least somewhat African-born to almost an entirely American-born population. Yeah. These are enormous changes. And Slave Country was an effort to explain how and why that happened. But I think about the title of that book now, Slave Country, which actually comes from a Mark Twain quotation from Huckleberry Finn. Although John Brown also uses the phrase. And I'm not sure that title would win me too many friends today in the the debates over where slavery belongs in the national narrative, because it's all right there. This was a slave country. Yeah. Some people don't like to face that fact.
I think that's one of the most difficult things about talking about slavery, or for historians of slavery or the US today, is sort of trying to explain to people who are not college students, right? Sometimes they're not college students, that it's not just that the history of the US matters because we are a democracy or all these other various things, but we have some of the most horrific events in our past, and you have to sort of understand that. So when your students, either it's maybe you're teaching a survey class or maybe it's an upper division class, how do you sort of reckon with the fact that maybe a lot of your students are American citizens, or maybe they're not, and you have to teach about this horrific thing that is really difficult to talk about?
Yeah, it's tough to talk about. I think one approach is to try to historicize it, to treat it as historians do, which is to try to understand slavery in its own context. Why did this institution get established in North America in the way that it did? Why and how did it expand? What were the arguments made for it? What were the arguments made against it? And ultimately, what led to its overthrow? That is an enormous historical question, and a really important one for anybody who thinks that there are things in this world that ought to change. Well, how does change happen? How does really fundamental revolutionary change happen? Well, we can debate how fundamental and revolutionary emancipation was, but something really important happens in the 19th century in the overthrow of slavery. And it's a really important history to think about how evil happens and how change happens. And I think those are some of the reasons why the history of the Civil War and everything around it remains of kind of enduring value and interest, not just to people in the United States, but it's, you know, one of those things people outside the United States are quite curious about and interested in when they think about American history.
Yeah.
So Adam, you're saying like something kind of fundamental changes in the 19th century in kind of the American attitude towards slavery. But you know, I'm thinking back to the thing we were talking about at the very beginning about the naturalization question, in which it's like a multiple choice, right? Like, what are the causes of the Civil War? Like, you know, slavery, economic reasons, or states' rights. And it's like, although they would accept all of them, like it's presented as an either or. So how do you kind of talk to somebody, and maybe not even like a Georgetown student, but just like a dude at a bar, right? Like, or, you know, like somebody like that, in which they're saying like, they want a simple answer. And it's, you know, I think this is something we struggle with as historians all the time, is like, people want a simple answer, but it's never a simple answer, right? So like, how do you answer that?
Yeah, first of all, don't ever talk to people at bars about the Civil War.
Especially in Virginia.
Especially in Virginia. Yeah.
Fair enough.
It's not going to end well.
Yeah.
For anybody. But I think that, yeah, I mean, first of all, every historian, every professional historian likes to say that things were complicated, more complicated than, you know, we at first believe.
Yeah.
I try to hesitate. I try not to do that, because it's a, you know, it is a starting point. It's a premise, I think, of everything we do. And I think too many historians end up concluding that everything is complicated or messy. Sometimes you hear that word a lot. And that's not a conclusion. And that's the starting point. And the world is complicated. We know that. The task of historians and other scholars is to try to explain it as best we can. Yeah. That means simplifying a very complicated world, but not into the simplest possible concepts. And that's what the kind of multiple choice thing does. So the idea that slavery, you know, that slavery somehow stands apart from economic reasons is an example of that. Slavery was an economic institution, a social institution with tremendous political ramifications, a whole morality and theology developed around it. It was, in that sense, a kind of total institution. It had tendrils that reached everywhere in society, and you can't treat it as this kind of shiny little box that had an outside and an inside. You know, it was connected to everything. And I mean, we can see that, like, Varsha, back to your question about how I teach my own students that. Well, the one way I do that is by focusing on Georgetown itself, which, you know, the whole history of American slavery is a vast topic, you know, touching centuries and millions of people with countless dimensions to it and an infinite number of stories. So that can be overwhelming, and it can lead to abstraction. But Georgetown's own history, as we've discovered over the last nearly a decade now, is really a microcosm of the whole history of American slavery. The Jesuits who founded Georgetown became tobacco planters and slave owners in Maryland. The Catholic leadership of the Chesapeake were slave owners. They founded Georgetown and stamped it in their image. The campus was a site of slaveholding. The campus was connected to a series of plantations operated by the Catholic clergy that was supposed to subsidize the institution. The Jesuit leadership of Georgetown ended up selling the people they owned in 1838 down to Louisiana, tapping into the domestic slave trade. You know, all of that happened. And even to today, the school's colors, you guys know the school's colors?
No.
You know Georgetown's colors?
Blue and gray, right?
They're blue and gray.
Yeah.
They're blue and gray.
Oh, you know, blue and gray, Confederate soldier blue and gray.
Yes, Confederate soldier gray and Union blue. And those colors were adopted in the late 1870s, actually by the school's rowing club, to signify the sectional reconciliation between Northern and Southern students at the school. So even today, you know, we wear the Confederate gray. That's part of our brand, right? So
messed up.
And
sorry.
Yeah, messed up. But that's the place I teach, and that's the place where my students are. And so that's the place that we go to understand this history. We have this incredible set of archives, the Jesuit archives, the college archives. I've helped to digitize them and curate them. So if any of the viewers here are interested, they go to the Georgetown Slavery Archive, slaveryarchive.georgetown.edu, and you can see all of these documents, including all the documents from the 1838 sale, which are probably the single best documented mass sale of enslaved people in all of American history.
Yeah.
That's right, like we're sitting on it at Georgetown. And so I, for the last several years have been teaching this history to Georgetown students through Georgetown's own history. And I have found that it makes a tremendous impact on the students in ways that more conventional ways of teaching this history just don't.
Yeah. So moving a little bit forward in time to emancipation, I don't know if you use Georgetown to teach about emancipation, but I did read a little bit about your second book, which is about specifically a single woman, right? And she sues this person who was her former owner because he kidnapped her 3 children, right? And it's like right at the end of the Civil War and in the beginning of Reconstruction. And so I was just wondering if one of the main reasons you wrote that, or one of the reasons you found that book useful when you're writing it, is to talk about African-American agency when it comes to not just ending slavery, but actually acting as American citizens. Did that book sort of teach you something about that? And is that one of the main things you sort of focus on when you teach Reconstruction or the end of the Civil War?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. That book, that book was just like a giant rabbit hole that I fell into. I think the story of how I got into that is kind of an instructive one for anybody who's wonders how historians arrive at the topics that they write about or the stories that they tell. I was actually in the middle of doing research on a book about New Orleans as a global city in the 19th century. I totally fell in love with New Orleans doing the research for my first book. It's a historian's dream.
It's a great city.
It's just a great city. It was after Katrina, and I had grown to love the city in a lot of ways, and wanted to write about it. And I was actually looking through a database of congressional publications for books that, or any material that had that talked about both New Orleans and Havana, because I was curious to see how those two cities were related, like in the documentation, because I knew they had a close connection. And pretty much the first thing that came up in my database search was a report that had been published by the Senate in 1866 on a rumor that was circulating through the Gulf South that newly freed people were being kidnapped and sold into slavery in Cuba and Brazil. I was stunned by this. I had never heard of this rumor before, and I just wanted to pursue it. And it turned out that most of this report was dedicated to the case of Rose Herrera, which is the woman I eventually wrote this book about. So I just started digging around and finding more and more stuff. And then eventually a couple of things clicked, and I realized that I actually could write a book about her, and just her, and use her story to understand some of the really important things that were going on around emancipation, including just the question of how newly emancipated people engaged the state, engaged the government to try to advance their very immediate interests, like how do I get my children back? Mm-hmm. So it connected this really intimate story with these grand processes of history, and I couldn't resist writing about it.
I think we too often, like historians kind of do this all the time, but we don't talk about it enough, is the role of serendipity. Like kind of as you're describing, is just like you stumble across something in an archive, or you read something and you just like you said, a rabbit hole that you just follow down, and it becomes this incredible warren of of meaning and anecdotes and stories that you can kind of build into this larger thing. So do you find that like kind of common in the research that you do, or do you think that was particular to this one case?
I did get lucky finding this source, and then finding some other things connected to it. But I don't want to toot my own horn, but we are professional historians, and you kind of make your own luck. Like you have to know where to look, you have to know what you found when you find it, and you have to know what to make of it, which often requires falling back on, years of reading around the topic and period that we're studying. So in other words, knowing enough about the context for these materials to make sense of them.
Yeah.
So that's something that, we try to teach our students. And I think we focus a lot, I'm sure both of you do as well, in trying to teach students how to understand primary sources. And you can do a tremendous amount to teach students close reading and the kinds of skills that they need to really, dig into sources. But at some point, you also need to know some history. You need to know what's going on around these sources in order to be able to understand them. And I think that's something that those of us who have really immersed ourselves in these periods and these literatures can bring to an understanding of history.
So quick question, because it's in the Q&A and it sort of might be a spoiler alert for your book. Was it true? Because I know that in Brazil, slavery is not ended until the 1870s, early 1870s. Were large numbers of free African Americans being sold into slavery in Cuba and Brazil from the US?
No.
Okay.
There are just a handful of documented examples. Of course, there are silences in the archives, and there may be more people that we don't know about, that were never found, that were never recorded. But the actual kind of documented number of cases is pretty small, and the story of Rose Herrera is one of them. But a couple of things to note. The first is, for me, Rose Herrera's story was also a way of understanding U.S. emancipation in this broader hemispheric or even Atlantic context. Because even though slavery in the United States was abolished, it still persisted in Cuba and Brazil until the 1880s. And as long as it did, there was always that threat or fear that someone could be sucked back into the vortex of slavery in these other places. So the lesson there is, nobody is really free until everybody is free. Yeah. That was one point. The other point is that even if it wasn't true, the rumor is still important for what it reveals about popular consciousness. Like people thought this was going on, and that meant something. That registered their fear of re-enslavement, whether elsewhere in the Atlantic world or maybe even in the American South, where there were various forms of either literal re-enslavement or the forcing of people into conditions that were near to slavery after the Civil War.
Black codes, right?
Yeah, black codes, that kind of thing. So this rumor registers those kinds of fears. And for me, it so we often ask the question, why didn't African Americans get 40 acres and a mule? Why wasn't the freedom that they won after the Civil War larger, more capacious, more fulsome? Why weren't they as free as they wanted to be? But this rumor, for me, opened up kind of another side to that world of possibility, which is that things could have been even worse. There could have been something like re-enslavement. You could argue that kinds of re-enslavement, does occur, but I think things should have been better, but they also could have been worse. Yeah. And that's something this case kind of unlocked for me.
Yeah. So I think there's this great question from the audience. Mark, he asked about why do you think Americans have this cultural amnesia around slavery and the founding of our country? I sort of want to add to that every Juneteenth, since Juneteenth became a really big thing a few years ago, where finally it was people started actually advocating for celebrating it and explaining the holiday, that there's this real obsession with certain Americans insisting that enslaved people did not free themselves, that it's all the Emancipation Proclamation, it's all the Civil War. So combined with, Mark's question about cultural amnesia, why is there this insistence in the US today that some people want a certain history, right? Especially about freeing enslaved people.
Yeah. Well, we want to believe we're a good country. Everybody wants to believe we're good. And that goodness was baked in from the beginning. And that emancipation was just like the natural unfolding of the American promise. And everybody thinks that they would have been an abolitionist in the 1850s, when in fact the abolitionists were a beleaguered minority. And everybody wants to believe they would have followed King, in the 50s, where in fact, King was quite unpopular nationally. So, we develop these myths to make us feel better. But I also think that there's a kind of myth involved in the idea of self-emancipation. And the idea of self-emancipation kind of absorbed too much of our American individualism. Because nobody frees themselves.
Yeah.
You can escape from, like, if you're a fugitive slave, you can escape from slavery into the North, but you're still not free.
Yeah, until the government insists and accepts that you are free.
Yeah,
There's always being
Right.
re-enslaved. That's the problem with the Fugitive Slave Act, right?
Yeah. So and there's no doubt that that slaves and free people of color during the Civil War engaged in resistance and flight and armed, enlisted in the Union Army and engaged in acts that really accelerated, pushed the abolition of slavery. But they didn't do it by themselves. It was a complicated political process with many layers, from the actions of enslaved people themselves all the way up to Lincoln. I don't want to take anything away from Lincoln. He's an interesting character. But there's all these intermediate figures. Jim Oakes wrote this book about the role of Republicans in Congress. There's military officers. I mean, there's everybody was involved. It's a complicated thing, and it's a political process. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that fact.
Yeah.
Some might say it's a messy history.
Yeah.
No, I would not say that. I would not say that.
It's actually
Okay.
it reminds me of the most favorite thing one of my professors ever said to me. It was back in freshman year. I'm this 18-year-old, unaware of a lot of things about history, and I'm at this dinner for faculty and undergrads. And I don't know this professor that well. All I know is that he studies early America. And I ask him, because I don't know what to say. I was like, who's your favorite founding father? And he gives me a 5-minute speech about how he doesn't believe in the concept. And it really, at the time, I was like, I've just insulted this man. But during the rest of that night, I'm like, he was talking about how, it's not fair to give all the credit to the American Revolution and the creation of the US to just a group of people who, signed a piece of paper in Philadelphia. There's
Right.
so much more to it. I think it's the same with slavery. So I just find it fascinating that people are finally trying to combine how Congress and Lincoln and all these people acted with the fact that African Americans actually had political agency. It's they're finally reading Black Reconstruction by DeForest.
I have to say that the real question is, who is your favorite founding father, and why is it Tom Paine?
So this goes to another burn by another professor in grad school. I go to the Hamilton musical in LA, and I come right back to my US history survey grad seminar the next morning, right? Wednesday morning, I'm in class because I have to give a presentation, and I'm wearing my Hamilton shirt that I've bought, and I'm super excited. And my professor walks in, and I'm talking to other people how Hamilton's been my favorite founding father since 4th grade, and she's like, Hamilton's your favorite father. Varsha, he was a financier. Read some Thomas Paine. And I was like,
You just keep stepping in it, Varsha.
I really do. And to make it serious, it is about how certain parts of American history are lionized to American students. And I can say that from firsthand experience. So
yeah. The other important lesson, of course, is if you're a graduate student, never try. Never try.
Oh God.
So we are unfortunately.
Isn't it?
It's messy. It's messy. So yeah, that's your takeaway from Drinking with Historians. Welcome back, everyone. It's messy and never try. So we are
the more you drink, the messier it gets.
The more perfection. So I mean, I have a whole bottle to get through. So anyway, so I'm not going to do that tonight. So nobody needs to call an ambulance for me. I'm old. It wouldn't work. But we are running out of time, and I did have one question. One of the questions I think we really like to ask all of our guests is it's just kind of like what made you like why did you get into history? Like what was it about that made you decide that this was something you wanted to do, that you wanted to become a professional historian, and then you kind of win the lottery and you get a tenure track job nowadays and become a professor? Like was there something like high school, college, something like that kind of pushed you in that direction?
I can't really point to an aha moment. Coming out of college, I loved my history courses. I have a true confession. I also really liked political science and international relations. And I actually applied to some schools in history and some schools in IR.
Oh my God.
And there was like this fork in the road.
Well, that's it, everybody. We're going to quit the episode right now. So
there's a fork in the road and I took it.
Yeah, to be fair, you chose correctly. You mentioned like early on Eric Foner, right? And like he was one of your advisors at Columbia. So that's actually how I got into history. Back in APUSH, the summer reading was sections from Who Owns History, and I learned the term historiography, and I fell in love with his writing, and I was like, that's it, this is it. And now here we are, almost 10 years later.
Foner is the man.
He is.
I think, in all seriousness, no, I think, one of the things I love about that question is everybody has a different answer, right? Is that sometimes it's one kind of aha moment. Sometimes it's just kind of like slowly, like you just kind of fall into it. Other times it's just like, yeah, it's just kind of what I did. And, but we wind up at the same place and realizing that the past is really important, right? And not just, as a way of understanding kind of, the past itself, but as a way of understanding both ourselves and also kind of the world that we find ourselves living in. I mean, this is also, I think, probably why this is so threatening to certain political communities in the modern United States and elsewhere as well. So
it's really important. Otherwise, we wouldn't fight about it.
Yeah,
that's right. So, well, thank you, everyone. We had a whole bunch of questions in the Q&A, and unfortunately, we don't have time. But one of the good things is that you can always email Adam. I will volunteer that. You can find him online. But also, too, is that Drinking with Historians is going to continue. We're actually going to be back in 2 weeks. Our guest will be Rachel Shine, who's a professor of Arabic and Religious Studies at University of Maryland. So we're staying in the DC kind of larger DC area there. She was an expert on early classical and medieval Arabic literature, works on race, racialization, gender, all sorts of really interesting stuff like this, old-timey stuff. So please,
you guys have an amazing range.
Yeah,
we do a little bit of everything.
We try to balance out for sure, because if it were just I just have.
We're also just like tremendous dilettantes. Like we don't actually know anything. We just kind of range over and we just drink whiskey and listen to people talk. So that's
how this whole show works. It's like
that's how this whole show works.
Yeah,
that's great.
So anyway, thank you everyone for joining us on this resurrection of Drinking with Historians, and especially thank you to you, Adam, for taking the time out and joining us on this episode. It's been really wonderful. Stay tuned for more information on Drinking with Historians, but until then, everybody, cheers.
Cheers.